Hello and welcome back to our series of lectures covering humanism in the 21st century. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 10, The City, which is a companion chapter to our previous chapter on the nation. What we're doing here is taking a deeper dive into the effects of national life. So we're moving into the period that we call modernity, which has been a focal point of this class, and specifically by the end of this class we'll be fully into the 20th century. But before we do that, we need to take a look at one of the oldest social formations, the city, and conceptualize it in terms of the way that it has been formulated in Western culture. And so the starting point for that discussion always comes back to the Greeks and the concept of the Greek city-state, or the polis. The word polis is our root for the word politics, and the reason for that is quite clear by the way that the Greeks lived. When they gathered together in these city-states, they lived close together. And in the fact of living close together, what they discovered is that they really needed to develop laws and social customs, and then eventually structures that we would call governance or government, as ways of coping with the fact of living together. And so what you get here is a really interesting relationship, right? Aristotle, remember, Plato's student, said that people are by nature of political animals, right? So that means something very interesting here. Sometimes we take that to mean that we all naturally love politics, which of course is not true. In the South, I've noticed that we have a great deal of discomfort with democratic politics. But when we conceptualize that more in terms of the root word polis, I think we can understand better what Aristotle is getting at, which is that the fact that we live together means that we have to create politics, right? So politics is actually a way of coping with the fact of city life, and our politics generate from the fact of living so close together, right? Why is that? For the Greeks, right, remember, they practiced various forms of government. In Athens, famously, there was a form of democracy, although not our concept of democracy today. But it does have some key similarities, right? One of them was that you had politicians, you had figures who were public figures who had to speak in public, and they had to sway an audience. And that meant that Greece not only saw the birth of the concept of politics that we use today, but also another Greek word, we saw the birth of rhetoric, right? Rhetoric means a way of presenting information so that it's more convincing. And what the Greeks quickly discovered is actually quite troubling. Right? It's troubling even still today, which is that sometimes bad information or wrong ideas can be presented in a way that makes them very appealing, and in that process you are able to convince at least enough people oftentimes to follow what turn out to be very bad ideas. That's called rhetoric, or at least that's one of the ways of understanding rhetoric, is that it's a structure of manipulation. Understand, too, that the Greeks were perfectly comfortable with that idea of manipulation. They were willing to engage in rhetoric just like any other contest. So you'll recall they loved Olympic sports. They loved warfare. They loved philosophy as a form of competition. They loved theater as a form of competition. Everything truly was about arete, or excellence, and really showing off in that particular way, and the better person should win, and that was a value that the Greeks really held. So rhetoric wasn't actually such an ethical issue for the Greeks as it is for us today, where when we think about manipulation, or the idea that politicians, for example, are always lying, what we're really getting at is actually a Platonic interpretation, right? A Platonic concept of rhetoric is able to rename rhetoric from a competitive system of advantage into something much different, a lie, right? The idea that politicians lie today is always contrasted in a binary fashion to the notion that there is a form of truth. And for the Platonic philosophers, no group of competitors represented this problem of rhetoric more than the sophists. The sophists take their name from the word sophos, which means wisdom in Greek, and it has the same root as our word philosophy, right? Philos, which means love, and sophos, right, of wisdom. And so the sophists were claiming to present people for a fee with skills in rhetoric that would make them more convincing, and that was really a mainstay of their appeal in Greek culture? Well, Plato, for really clear reasons, was deeply disturbed by that notion of relativity, right? The idea that language is unmoored to some absolute truth and can simply be used in any way that you want to manipulate the ways that people think, or even what they want, right? What they think is important. These ideas are antithetical to the Platonists. And for Plato, in his own biographical experience, he saw firsthand just how dangerous this rhetorical world of the polis could be. When his beloved teacher Socrates was condemned by the Athenians for corrupting the youth of Athens. That was officially the charge. What the Athenians were really getting at is that he was disturbing the social order. Socrates as a teacher was not like Plato. He didn't present answers, but he did really challenge people with questions, and he did that unstintingly. He never gave anybody any leeway in their process of thought or the assumptions that they made about the world. And this led to a certain amount of social conflict in Athens. He was condemned for corrupting the youth of Athens. He did present his own defense, and it's worth noting also that he was narrowly convicted. In other words, all the Athenians voted who were there, and he was only voted to be condemned by a small margin. So many of the Greeks actually did not agree with this ruling. And it was fully expected that in this case, Socrates would flee to another city and start his life over. That was sort of normally what you would do in this case. But Socrates, being the wonderful philosopher that he is, took his own position very seriously. And he said, after he was condemned, well, I've benefited from living in Athens. I've followed the laws as best I can, but also those laws have served and helped and protected me. And what kind of person would I be if I simply broke the law when it was convenient for me, even if it involved my own life? So he was being very consistent there and insisting on that consistency. And so that meant for him that he needed to obey the condemnation. He needed to commit suicide, which he did by drinking a poison known as hemlock, which is a paralytic. It makes your heart stop beating. And so all of Socrates' students gathered around. That's the image that you see here depicted much later by a French artist in the realist period. And Socrates, as you see in the center here, is holding up his principles. And that's what his arm with pointing to the heavens is supposed to be. And he's going to live and then also die by those principles. Well, Plato, who loved Socrates very much, I think, never forgave Athens and the Athenians for this travesty. And I think for most people, the trial of Socrates truly is a tragedy and a disaster for philosophy. But where Plato went with it, I think, is actually quite disturbing, right? So Socrates, as we know, did have some criticisms of democracy, but we know those criticisms specifically through Plato. And where we hear about them the most is in Plato's masterpiece, his longest work and his most important work in many ways, known in English as the Republic, which is not a good name for it because it actually is not about republican democracy. It's against those principles. The title of the book in Greek originally is Politeia, which does not specifically mean republic or democracy. It means simply a way of having a society, so a sort of social organization or contract, but that doesn't fit very well into a book title. I'll come back to Plato's Republic in just a minute, but for now I want to talk about Socrates as a character in Plato's world and the way that Plato used Socrates to represent democracy. So in the discussions that Socrates has with his interlocutors in this piece written by Plato, remember they're all dialogues, so they're always characters speaking instead of Plato writing in his own voice. And in this dialogue, Socrates brings up really interesting points that we should think about and pause here to really consider. So Socrates likens the city or the politics of a city to a ship. Right, and that's actually a metaphor we still use when we say the ship of state. And so think about it as a group of people who are all stuck together, right, like in a city or in a culture or a community, and they have to figure out who's going to lead them, right? And in the case of danger, let's say that the ship is threatened by a storm, then the the people probably want to choose somebody who can captain them safely through this storm, right? And then Socrates says, okay, given that metaphor, right, that association there that he's drawing out, who would you rather have captaining your ship? Would you want it to be the person with the best expertise, even if he wasn't very well loved, even if, for example, he didn't try to make himself very popular or really tell people things that they wanted to hear? Or would you rather have a vote of popularity, right, where people got together and they just chose the person that they liked the best? Well, Socrates obviously, I think, is presenting us with a certain problem in democracy, right, which is that democracy can, at least in many contexts, be manipulated by rhetoric, where we choose the person we like the best, even if perhaps they're not the most qualified, or even they're not the most functional for the particular needs at the hand of the state at the moment. So if we think of the ship as our community and our society, Socrates invites us to really consider who should be in charge. And if those people that we are electing are not those people, then why? Is there a fault line in democracy itself that we need to really consider? All right. So the key weaknesses of democracy, as Socrates brings out, are very interesting. I encourage you to watch the video "Why Socrates Hated Democracy." It goes into these details. One more thing I want to point out too about this problem of rhetoric for Socrates is that when you have a contest between two different speakers and they're both trying to use rhetoric, Socrates imagines a contest between two figures, one a doctor and the other one a sweet shop merchant. So one is going to give you sweet things and be able to promise you all kinds of nice delights, and the other one is going to say, well, this is going to be uncomfortable and unpleasant, but at the end of the day you're going to be healthier, right? So his point also is that the person who tends to have the best answers may not always be the most viable candidate for us emotionally, even within the framework of rhetoric, because of what their aims are. So the larger aims of what our leaders are trying to get to oftentimes get clouded by the need to appeal to us in our present desires. It's more fun to eat candy and sweets and things that we like to eat rather than having somebody tell us that we need to get on a diet and be careful in terms of this concept of our long-term health. And we often do this politically in a democracy too, right? The question has been for a long time, can democracy last as a long-term viable option for society, given this tendency of people to look to the short-term needs and then therefore be more available to that specific kind of rhetoric? Well, Plato had all of this in mind when he developed his criticisms of democracy, and he did it, of course, through a conversation about his favorite teacher who was murdered, as he saw it, because of democracy, the fault lines or weaknesses in democracy. Okay, but what Plato really did when he responded to this was go to the other extreme in this discussion, and I think it's had a tremendous influence on the way we think about politics, rhetoric, and the concept of manipulation in general. So I'd like to go ahead and name that really extreme position that Plato takes on the other side of this conversation. I'd like to call it Platonic panic. The idea that unless you have complete continuity of identity, right, and complete meaning in a clear, truthful way, in the way that Plato would think of eidos, then instead all you get is utter chaos, right? That you get meaninglessness, untruth or lies in every context, and the inability to recognize anything in your world. How does that work? Well, it's interesting to think about the fact that Plato's teacher, Socrates, in his actual life, didn't really agree with Plato's notion of Platonic panic, that you have to have identity or there's nothing at all. For example, one of the few things that we do know from Socrates' own mouth, and this, by the way, was something he said during his trial, is that he learned from the oracle, the pagan oracle that the Greeks followed, that he was the wisest man in all of Greece. And that confused him at first. He said, why was I called the wisest man in all of Greece? There's so many people who are smarter than me, more capable than I. And then eventually he realized, I understand. It's because I'm aware of the fact that I know so little, right? And so then he says, wisdom actually is about knowing what you don't know, being willing to recognize that there are limits and bounds to your own knowledge, and being willing to investigate those limits. Of course, it's not enough to stop there, and Socrates really is an emblem of that endless curiosity. And yet, if you think about Plato, right, in his philosophy, he really presents the opposite approach, doesn't he? He says, I'll tell you the truth of everything. I'll explain the entire world. In fact, I'll explain you to yourself, your own concept of identity, how you understand things. And that, for a very long time afterwards, has been the goal of philosophy. Quite an arrogant goal, I think it's fair to say. And the Socratic process is very different than this Platonic presentation of truth, and the way that we talk about the Socratic method is through the word elenchus. Elenchus is the process of questioning that Socrates goes through. So if he doesn't know anything, what he really wants to do is question everybody else. And what happens as he's questioning them in the search of knowledge is that it's uncovered that everybody else also does not know what they're talking about, right? And so instead of raising the conversation, what Socrates really sort of does is get everybody down into the world of confusion that he inhabits, and we're all there together. And that's actually a very productive moment. In my classes, when we're teaching and talking about these very difficult and challenging topics, we walk through, I'm looking for those moments in which we can say that our confusion is productive, right? We can say we don't know something now, and the fact that we recognize that we don't know what it is means that we can actually go through the process of starting to investigate it. And that process, that moment of uncertainty, is called aporia. Aporia is that moment in which you say, oh, I'm so confused, I'm so uncertain, I don't know anymore. And yet it's also the beginning point of true learning, right? Think about when you began this class. I'm guessing that you hadn't thought about the majority of the material that we're covering here. And certainly there's no particular reason in your daily life. And yet if you found any of this interesting or surprising as you've gone along, then you've gone through that precise process of elenchus, in which something that wasn't confusing or strange to you before suddenly has become that. And then the aporia is that moment of opening up to the possibility of learning. And so Socrates develops a method that in many ways requires us to stay calm in the face of uncertainty, or to deal with the unknown and recognize the complexity of the world and really revel in it, but in a way that doesn't demand that Platonic panic set in at any point. So now that we've set the stage a little bit, we understand how different the teacher was from the student, how different Socrates was from Plato. Let's think about Plato's book, The Republic, which I mentioned earlier. So in the Politeia, or the Republic, Socrates as a character, right, in the Republic, presents what's known as the allegory of the cave. And this is a really key moment in Book 6 of the Republic, in which Plato is going to present to us the concept of eidos and how his theories of Platonic identity are really going to function. And he asks us to imagine a cave. In this cave, you have slaves who have been born into this cave and are chained in such a way that they can see nothing except for the shadows on the wall. They're down here in the bottom corner. And the shadows on that wall are created by an artificial light, like a fire. And every day people pass by with images and shapes that cast shadows on that wall. And the slaves, who have never known anything else, mistake those shadows for reality. It's their world, right? Until one day, just one of these slaves is somehow released from his shackles, and he walks out of the cave and he comes into the light of the true day, right? And at first, when he comes out into that light, his eyes are blinded by the brightness. They have to adjust, and it takes a very long time. But as they do slowly adjust, what does he see? He starts to see not the shadows of things, but the reality around him, doesn't he? He sees the reality of the real world, and his eyes are opened in a more fundamental or metaphorical sense to the fact that he's been deluded in mistaking these shadows for reality, and now he truly sees. Well, very excitedly, the slave wants to go back to the other slaves and tell him what he's found. And when he does that, he goes back to the slaves, but they, instead of rejoicing at the discovery of a real, true reality, they get angry with him and they say, why are you disturbing our world, right? This is what we know. You're telling us about something else that we can't see or touch or feel. And actually, in at least some versions of the story, they're violent towards this man. So it's an emblem of Socrates himself, right, within the world of Athens, who was ultimately condemned to death for precisely this kind of questioning. But notice what Plato is doing in this allegory. He is telling us that there is a larger reality out there, that the world around us right now is a kind of a shadow realm. And that shadowy world is one we mistake for reality because we were born into this kind of mental slavery in which we were unaware of what those conditions of true knowledge would be. But if we could somehow escape this reality, then we would leave that space of the shadow realm and see for the first time the deeper reality, and we'd never forget that, and we'd never mistake the two again. Well, Plato thinks that this is the purpose of philosophy, right? Is to awaken us to this condition. The problem here, though, is that this story, in a rhetorical fashion, by the way, is very misleading, isn't it? Plato makes a really big assumption, which is, several assumptions, but they all hang on this key assumption, which is that there's another deeper reality out there than the one that we're in. And it's certainly tempting to think that. And many cultures, many religions, many philosophies have built some sort of notion referencing this concept of a greater or deeper reality. And yet, as I've said throughout this class and really argued, that the reality that we are faced with, that we experience in our daily life, is precisely this world of representation, isn't it, right? So what Plato wants to do is distinguish between reality and representation. And what we've been arguing is that there's no good evidence for that distinction in the first place. Representation is what we have, not because we don't want to get to reality, but because the very process of becoming a human in which we engage in language and culture actually shifts and makes that world that we live in look different to us. And in fact, the way that it's made to look different to us is what makes us human. We create a reality for ourselves, both physically and mentally, so that we can cope, and so that we can have community, and so that we can have all the things that we enjoy about being human, along with the difficulties and challenges. And I would say that Socrates seems to be much more comfortable with that process than Plato. Right? Plato really wants to overcome that in a moment of panic and say there's a deeper reality here that we can cling to. And what I think we start to do in the 20th century is come to a greater degree of intellectual maturity in the realization that that simply is not something that we can hold on to if we want to actually describe the world that we live in and what it means to be human. And perhaps the best proof of this problem in Plato's thought, his model of thinking here, is that in the Republic, he actually suggests that we shouldn't have democracy, because after all, it's all of the people who live in the shadow realms who would therefore be voting and therefore vulnerable to all of these manipulations of presentation, right? They don't understand truth. And so instead, what Plato suggests is that the best form of government that he could imagine is one in which there is a philosopher king or queen, by the way, it could be a woman, who is in a dictatorial position of absolute totalitarian control over the people, right? Because as the person who sees reality the most, that person should be in complete control. And those who are living in the shadow realm are simply going to have to follow those orders. In order to carry out those orders, this philosopher king also has a number of guardians who form something equivalent to a police state, right? They go around and make sure that everybody is behaving all of the time. And Plato, in order to promote this idea, suggests what he calls the noble lie, which is, in summary, the idea that the philosopher should lie to the people and manipulate them as much as possible in the service of a greater truth that only that philosopher knows. All right, so if any of this sounds a little fishy, that's because, right, we know about this problem through the various historical examples of totalitarian dictatorship. When you have a dictator, whether that's a monarch or a crazed maniac like Hitler, or a benevolent dictator who wants the best for his or her people, in any of those cases, the trouble is, what's really disturbing about that is you're stuck in only one person's reality. right? So if that person truly were in some deeper condition of knowledge, if they could do what Plato is proposing, then perhaps we would have different conditions and we would have to talk about this differently. But because there is no such thing as escaping the world of representation, what we have instead is the different ethologies, the different world perspectives of different peoples, right? So if you have somebody who grew up in a very rich and powerful environment, they cannot simply, no matter how smart they are, be aware of the needs of people who have grown up in conditions of poverty and deprivation. They can think about it, they can empathize perhaps at some level if they learn about it, but anybody who has seen this difference knows that we have these kinds of problems in our own structure of democracy as well. If somebody cannot relate to another person's concern, it becomes very difficult to build a politics that takes care of both of those groups mutually. So what Plato ends up falling on here is the exact rhetoric that he began by trying to criticize, right? He wanted to move away from the problems of democracy, which he labeled as this ability to manipulate the people. And yet what he concludes in the Republic is that as long as this philosopher king agrees with Plato's philosophy, then it's okay to manipulate the people through these noble lies. That doesn't really cohere, right? And in fact, Plato's Republic is not the one that succeeds the Greek democracy or democratic experiment. Instead, it's the Roman Republic. And this is where we actually get the word republic. It's a Roman word, so it's from Latin, not from Greek. And it is a shortening of two different words, which is res and publica. Publica is just what it sounds like. It's public. And res is a very generic word for stuff or things. So if you can't think of a word, for example, you would say that res over there, that thing over there. And so it's a very unostentatious word. It's a very simple word. Res publica is the concept that people hold things in common, and as they hold things in common, then they should have government in common as well to take care of those public things. So you have your private life, and then you have your res publica. In the United States, we also have a republic or a res publica, and we sometimes refer to it in the English translation as a commonwealth, which is exactly what republic refers to. Well, something very interestingly different happens in the Roman Republic. They still have the forms of democracy that we're familiar with public speaking and the need to be elected, right, to office, and then the way that political power functions in those systems. But it also is a system with a much larger population. So the Greek polis was a small city-state, right? Relatively local. Everybody could know each other. Probably at the height of the Athenian population, only 60,000 people could really even be involved in government in any meaningful way. That's because most people were excluded, right? Women couldn't participate. If you were a slave, you couldn't participate. If you were a foreigner, you couldn't participate. If you were a minor, not old enough, then you couldn't participate, and so on. So there are many, many forms of exclusion. Perhaps the most important for the Greeks was the fact that you had to own property, right? So you had to be wealthy to a certain degree. In the Roman Republic, representation is still based along gender lines and the other divisions, but the population is so large that you actually have a huge group of people who feel that they are Roman citizens. And it's very important to note that the property distinction that the Greeks had actually doesn't count for the Romans, or at least not in the same way, right? You had to have property in order to run for office and hold it in many contexts, but in order to vote, you could just be a commoner, a common person. That meant that with such a large representative structure that you had to have what we now call representatives. And again, this is something that we have in common with the Roman Republic, where today we elect people to represent us. We don't go to Congress directly. We don't vote in the Senate. We elect a senator, and that senator represents us. Well, the Greeks really did not do that. They had direct democracy, and the Romans instead did this representational structure. That's because Rome is the first mass culture. Rome is the first place, at least within the framework of the Western world that we're looking at, the first place where you had what we now think of as masses. Lots and lots of people who are anonymous to each other. there were more than 1 million people living in Rome itself, just one city, right? So it was no longer a city-state. It truly was a mass culture with all kinds of imperial ambitions, right? And the way that this mass culture really worked was through military conquest, and that's how we get the concept of empire, right? Rome was the first modern empire that we have good historical records about. The way that they did that was by enlisting lots and lots of soldiers, right? Common people could become soldiers, and in fact, this was a really good way to gain wealth. And one of the things that they did was brilliantly to create a system by which the conquered areas could also gain new soldiers by enlisting them with the promise of becoming Roman citizens, right? So when you were a Roman soldier, you didn't look for heroism or bravery, you simply followed orders, and it was really the disciplinary structure in the serried orders of ranks where you were organized into groups of 100 soldiers, and you were overseen by your centurion, the guy whose name means 100, right? So he saw you as his troops, and then he would respond to somebody else, and so on up the chain of command. And these armies in this system could get huge, in much different way than the Greeks, right? The Greeks were much more interested in heroism and honor and those kinds of notions, whereas the Romans were interested in what we call virtue, virtus, which technically means manliness, but really had to do with following laws and obeying when you were supposed to. So when you did that for a long enough time, then eventually you were granted Roman citizenship if you didn't have it, and you were granted a certain amount of money, a certain amount of land, and the opportunity to do the thing that all Romans wanted to do most, which was to become independently wealthy. It was a materialist culture. Their concept of wealth is very different than ours. It included mostly just the idea of having a farm and being independent from the rest of the world on that farm. But the discipline that you were supposed to undergo in the army was supposed to make you a Roman citizen. So even after you went to live on that farm and became a private citizen, that discipline really pervaded the whole culture, right? So the Romans really discovered something immensely important here. If you're going to have a mass culture, you have to have techniques of self-discipline. And we've already discovered that those are part of our culture too, right? That was what Michel Foucault was talking about, that we discipline ourselves in our own society as well. We don't do it specifically through the armed forces, although that is one of the ways that it happens. But that's for a tiny minority of people. The vast majority of us instead get this discipline through our socialization and things like educational systems. One of the things that this meant, though, this mass disciplining of people, is that you had to have a lot of stuff for all of these people, right? For the Greeks, you were on your own. You were wealthy, or else you were perhaps nothing, right? So there was a strong class divide, and that was normalized in Greek Athenian democracy. But in Roman culture, everybody as a Roman citizen had certain rights, and the notion of having those universal rights meant that people really clamored for and wanted a lot. And they wanted a lot of material goods, they wanted a lot of things. Think about this in terms of the Roman army itself. All of those soldiers had to be outfitted, right? Those tens and tens of thousands of soldiers who marched all over Europe and then eventually the Middle East and North Africa and conquered these territories, they all had to have all of the armor and the swords and the shields and the horses and the weaponry, etc., for this. And that meant that these things had to be produced not just one at a time, but by many, many times, right? And that's where we get the concept that we still live with in our modern mass culture, that the copy, the things that are copious, which is what the word comes from the Latin word copious, that the copy is actually the better thing because it gives us a multiplicity of goods, and we need that for mass representational structure. If we're elitist and we're living in Greek Athens, then we don't believe in the copy, right? And remember, Plato was extremely critical of the idea of the copy. He wanted the real and the true and the original, and he valued that. We could say with the Romans, for the first time, we start to recognize the copy and the copious world of the material goods that we can create through that mass culture are actually the positives. And again, I think that there's no better emblem of this than the famous Roman aqueducts. If you look at the aqueduct, it's a simple arch structure, but they repeat it over and over and over again. And it was with these aqueduct structures that they were able to run fresh water all the way from the mountains outside of Rome into the city to create fresh drinking water fountains, which of course were actually incredibly important, weren't they? Because if you have a large city, then you need things like sewage and you need fresh water, or else people are going to die. It wouldn't be a trivial matter at all. So these aqueducts represent that copiousness, right? Copiousness of water and freshness, and copiousness through the reproduction of these simple models over and over again. Amazingly, by the way, if you go to Rome today, you will still find that those same fountains are working with clean, delicious water that is coming over those aqueducts that were built 2,000 years ago. So obviously their system really worked. So I want to stop here and summarize something that we've been talking about and around a little bit, and I'll come back to this idea later on in class, which is the way that Plato feels in summary about the problem of the copy. So remember, for him, a copy is always contrasted to what is real, and identity is real. Remember, if you have an eidos, then you have an essence, and that's not the same. And remember, this is also the key for us of our notion of authenticity, autos, having a self, relies on this notion of having a real personal identity. So if we think about the notion of the copy, then we're dealing with a totally different notion than Plato's, right? One that he's talking against, but also a different way of seeing the world. Whereas for Plato, the essence of things, their being, is more important than how they change. You'll recall that all the way back from chapter 1 in Heraclitus. In this context, we can actually reverse that process. The copy is the process of having iterations, reiterations of things constantly, right? In Greek culture, and the one that we inherit specifically from Plato, then our notions of personhood really rely on being, don't they, rather than change or becoming. Our legal and social structures really rely on that Platonic process of being rather than change. Our concepts of, for example, identity formations like gender, sexuality, and the other sociological categories, those are very important. Also, our cultural concepts of what is best or right or most beautiful. All of these things come from Plato. And they come specifically from our contrasting relationship between the copy and the real. If the real and our concept of identity or eidos really founds so many of our important values like personhood, our legal structure, our notions of identity, and our culture, then why would we ever introduce something else? Well, what happened in the 20th century is we started to break with some of the underlying assumptions that the copy is bad and that therefore it's inferior or a shadowy realm to the real that we can find. And the reason that we did that the most is that we simply didn't find any real out there that we could discover outside of this world of shadowy representation. And so it was that turn away from these problems that brought us to a point where we were intrigued by the problem of Plato, right? He's presented us with solutions, but instead they turn out to be question marks. My favorite investigation of this set of issues is actually a film that started at the turn of the 21st century, The Matrix. And I've got a clip here from the first Matrix movie that I invite you to watch. If you're familiar with the movie, this will make a lot more sense. You should see all three of them. They're really good just all by themselves. But here in this passage, what we see is that Neo, Keanu Reeves' character, is presented by Morpheus, Lawrence Fishburne, with the idea of suddenly experiencing the real, and how tempting that is, right? Who wouldn't want to see the reality and discover that all this time they've been that slave who's chained and seeing just the shadows play on a wall? But if you watch all of the movies, Keanu Reeves goes through a process of discovery in which he realizes, right, that this very notion that there's a deeper reality is actually one of the fictions that he has to overcome, right? It's one of the cultural forms of representation. So in other words, the trilogy itself walks you through that entire process of discovery from Plato to the critiques that we get in the 21st century, or 20th and 21st centuries. Okay, so something else happens here too. When we have the birth of the Roman Republic, not only do we shift away from Plato's model of uniqueness into one of mass culture that we then rediscover again later on with the period of modernity, but also we build a number of terms that are still central to the way that we conceptualize our culture today. So I've got some words here for you to look up. One of them I've already talked about, or several of them actually. Res publica, you'll recall, is public things. Polis is the city-state that is the root of our word politeia, or politics rather. And politeia is the Greek word for the social contract, the way that we create social communities. The two new words here are civis, which is the Roman word for citizen, right? Which of course is very important to us too. We are American citizens, or we are citizens of another country, and we feel that citizenship is very important. It's where we get our concept of rights, right? The notion that all Americans should be treated equally under the law, for example, is a concept that comes from the notion of the civis, or the civis Romanus, as it was talked about during the Roman Empire, the Roman citizen, who, no matter where that citizen was in the empire, always should be treated in a legal and just manner, precisely because of this magical condition of citizenship. So that was invented in many ways by the Romans. The other word here is a Greek word, but it really becomes more of an issue for the Romans because of mass culture. Demos is the word for people, but not a individual people or a group of people as in an ethnos, but rather it is the people as in the masses. And this is where we get our word democracy. Demos, the people, and then kresi, which means the rule or control. So control by the people, rule by the people, democracy. Demos is a very tricky term for us because we don't actually know what the demos is, right? As a citizen, you can be an individual, but the demos is always they, the masses, the big group. And we do all kinds of polling and questioning and looking for trends to try to figure out what the people want or need or how they feel. But in fact, we know in reality that there is no way to grasp what that demos is at any given moment, right? It changes all the time. That's why we have elections, because we don't just take a poll or ask everybody and then get the idea and move on. We have to have elections as a way of artificially freezing that moment-to-moment changing difference that the demos actually always embodies. And so I want to read you a good summary here from the textbook that you're working with, which I think really discusses this problem of the demos or democracy and the way that Plato's philosophy has a hard time coping with that world of difference. So the passage reads, "Democracy is the fault line in Plato's philosophy because it actively deconstructs claims to universal truth. The imagined communities of shared narratives shift as new arguments and perspectives, new ways of life, and defamiliarizing representational modalities are introduced into the politeia. This hybridity is an expression of the demos without essence or teleology, an unimaginable framework from a Platonic point of view, but the actual observable fact of everyday life in a functioning democracy." Okay, what this passage is getting at is the idea that democracy is actually a fluid world, right? It's much more of a Heraclitean world, right, where we get this river that we never step into in the same way twice. And the fact that we live with this change and we are able to cope with it actually tells us something very important about Platonic panic, right? We don't need identity to be so fixed and stable. We know that because, in fact, many aspects of our life, just like our copious mass culture, don't actually rely on this strict eternal concept of identity. We have a shifting concept of identity with shape-shifting borders, right? And a lot of transit between things that are supposed to be different. And that relationship of complexity that we actually experience in a day-to-day life is an important one to always keep in mind, because while I always want to remind you that Plato has great arguments and makes very good and important points about identity, and many aspects of our modern world would not be possible without Platonic identity, nonetheless, the Platonic panic that's embedded in his philosophy actually doesn't serve us, because it doesn't actually describe the reality that we live in, right? Which is one of change and complexity and shifting boundaries rather than stasis, universality, and ahistorical permanence. The fact that things change really reminds us always that Heraclitus had a good point too, right? And so what we want to do, I would argue, is learn to balance between those two conditions, right? Identity and change, and really make those two things function for us. As I said, in the period of modernity, we start to take these ideas on much more seriously, and perhaps the first modern formulation of the problem that was brought up in Greece and Rome originally in our modern world is formulated by Thomas Hobbes and social contract theory. Thomas Hobbes is somebody I talk about quite a bit in my American constitutionality class because he's such an interesting figure in so many ways for starting to think about modern democracy. But in short summary here, he lived through the English Civil War in which Charles I, the reigning monarch at the time, was beheaded by the masses, by the people who rose up against him and took over that form of government, at least for a short period of time. This horrified Hobbes, but it also made him realize something. It made him realize that the king did not rule by the divine right of kings. He wasn't granted by God an immunity or some special powers. In fact, the king, just like any ruler, ruled because of the people's agreement to be ruled. Okay, so social contract theory is the idea that we all give some of our power to the people who are in power so that we can maintain a stable society. Thomas Hobbes, it's important to recognize, actually had a very dim view of humanity. He thought that we were wolves to each other, right? He said that if we could, we would all devour each other. And so what we really need is a strong authoritarian social structure, like a king, a monarch, a dictatorship, in order to keep us all in check. He would not have been very comfortable with democracy. If you look at the frontispiece of his book, which is called Leviathan, you see that the king is actually composed of all of the people. This is a good image where you can really see a lot of those people. And that is a good expression of social contract theory. We all make up the society, but we agree to give up some of our power, for Hobbes specifically, the power to do violence to each other, so that the state, the larger society, can rule over us. And we all actually do follow a social contract of some sort, don't we? Even if we might disagree with some of Thomas Hobbes' arguments here about the evil nature of humans, I certainly would take issue with that. But nonetheless, I do have to acknowledge that I do follow the laws of society for the greater good as well as for my own benefit. Right? If we didn't do that, there would simply be no society. There would be no contract. We would break that relationship. So the social contract for Hobbes really comes down to the notion of the state of nature. And this is a phrase that's actually first introduced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a theorist whom we've met several times in this class. And the idea of a state of nature is the underlying question of whether or not we're good or bad, right? Are we naturally wolves, so that, like in the movie Purgatory, or something like that, if we had the opportunity, would we simply run amok and go and kill each other or murder each other or something like that? That is one of the negative fantasies that we sometimes have about society. Or instead, as Rousseau argued, are we actually naturally good? Are we naturally innocent? You'll recall that his book on education, Émile, was all about how good children are when they're born, how naturally innocent and sweet they are. That's something we celebrate, right? So we may think that adults perhaps are suspicious, so we are Hobbesian in some context socially. We also still love the innocence of people, and we celebrate that in the innocence of children. So we're a bit of a contradiction, aren't we, right? We're the inheritors of this larger argument. However, I would argue that where you land on that particular question of the state of nature will tell you a lot about your own political views. If you think that people are by nature bad, or at least have a strong tendency in that direction, then you'll land on the more conservative Hobbesian side of wanting control, social order, and structure, perhaps even at a large personal cost. Whereas if you're Rousseauian, you think people are naturally good, then you tend to make choices that are more what we come to call liberal, right? As in liberal democracy, that we maximize freedoms because we trust people to use those freedoms really well. These ideas were summarized summarized and brought together beautifully in the philosophy of the social contract theory that we get developed in the 18th and the 19th centuries, and they become the foundation and the bedrock for American democracy, most specifically through the wonderful writings of John Locke, whom I've also introduced and discussed in this class, and I talk about quite a bit more in the class on American constitutionality. Locke kind of brings together some of Rousseau's ideas and some of Hobbes and comes up with a very balanced perspective on these problems that are simply too complex for me to get into here in this specific context, but are worth reading and learning about. I'll summarize Locke's importance by saying that without John Locke, we would not have American democracy. Right? So he really is such a significant figure in that discussion. So we do form democracy, right? We do succeed at this, and we actually prove Thomas Hobbes wrong, at least to a key degree, in his notion of what people are like. And one of the things that happens as we enter into our new era of mass culture, mass democracy, is that we start to urbanize, right? When America is founded as a republic, it is by and large unpopulated. Most of the Native Americans had died off from disease, and then the rest were forcibly removed from their lands. And so there was a tremendous amount of space, and there was a lot of immigration in the 19th century that tended to grow the urban spaces on the East Coast. And so we started to have the new phenomenon of urbanization in the United States, where more and more people moved into more and more tightly packed areas, and that's a trend that's only continued. In fact, we just reached a really interesting world milestone where now more than half of the human population around the world lives in cities rather than outside of those cities. And that has never happened before in the history of humanity. So we have a really big watershed moment here going on culturally. So let's stop here and think about urbanization, which truly is the end result of mass democracy, isn't it, right? As people live in the polis, the community of the polis creates that politics, and now we have a mass community politics, and that's really where our modern world has ended up. So the social contract theory thought of politics in a vacuum, right, with an imaginary primitive man at the origin of civilization and a series of Cartesian rational trade-offs along the way toward social governance. What this means is that when Thomas Hobbes or Jean-Jacques Rousseau are imagining people and what they are, they put them in this kind of artificial condition that is not how we experience life. We're born into culture, aren't we? We're not born outside of it in the wild, running around in some, fantasy utopia. We are in the world, and the way that we become human is by being introduced to that. We've seen that with language and with culture, and the assumptions that are embedded in that language and that culture have profound influences on us. So when we live in this modern urban life, we have a new environment that reshapes many of these assumptions that we've been making about the world. As I said at the very beginning of this class, what's remarkable to recognize about a city is that every single part of a city has been touched by human hands. Right? It's a human construct in every single way. And that changes in many ways what it means to be human. Up until this point, we have been very much in the world of Darwin, right? Nature as well as the evolutionary accident of mutation were the two major factors. But for the first time in human history, we truly are coming to a condition in which we can shape almost every attribute of our lived environment. That means that the rules are somewhat changed, and so we have to pause here and start to really think about how those rules have changed. I have a great video here that's done by an older director, King Vidor. If you like old films, then you certainly heard his name. This one is called The Crowd. It's about a young man who goes to New York to make his way. And this opening sequence, the montage sequence of this film, is absolutely incredible as an illustration of the early 20th century experience of living in these new mass cities, things that people had never seen before. New York certainly was the metropolis of the 20th century. So In order to cope with these changes, we developed a new field of sociology. And sociology, it's not an exaggeration to say, is really born with mass culture. In fact, the so-called father of sociology, Emile Durkheim, was somebody who was intrigued by modern urban life. He lived in Paris, and he saw the changes that were going on where people from the countryside were streaming into the city and trying to cope with these sudden changes that they were living through. And so he starts to develop theories about what happens when we have mass culture for the first time in these large urban spaces, and he notices something negative happens, and this is really important. He's struck by the sudden rise in suicides at the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is something that's unprecedented before this period of time, at least as far as we know. And Durkheim wants to try to explain why this effect of mass culture is going on. And that's the birth of sociology, trying to explain why we as big groups of people, as masses, do what we do and act the way that we act. And so he theorizes that the sudden change of living in these urban spaces, in these completely artificial human cultural spaces, that they break down what we thought of as our reality beforehand, right? So it changes our normative structure of society, and that leads to a loss of sense of integration in our reality, the world that we think that we're in. So think again ethologically. We're suddenly thrown into a new environment where the rules are entirely different, and as those rules change, our concept of what's normal and what's right tends to break down. Well, that's where Durkheim introduces probably his most famous term, enemy, to try to describe this experience. This is a word that we still use today, although it's important to recognize exactly how Durkheim meant it. It comes from the word nomos, which means laws, as in cultural laws, how people live. What Socrates got in trouble for when he was held in trial was for breaking the nomos, the cultural norms of the Athenian Greek society. The A there is an important part of that word. It's called an alpha privative, and it means it's not or negative. It's the negation, like the word non from Latin that we use more frequently. So enemy, actually specifically means the loss of those social regulatory laws that we rely on in culture. And when that happens, when these things break down, then we experience a loss or vertiginous sense of the loss of norms. And this is a really interesting concept, especially now, because we're actually living through this condition again, aren't we, culturally? The internet and the globalization that we live through right now has produced another round of this experience of enemy. If you look back in the 20th century, the development of the urban city, which I'll talk about more specifically in just a moment, was one of those moments of enemy. But then when we invented the automobile and the radio and the airplane in short order, people again experienced a tremendous amount of enemy. Then again after that, when we developed television and many of the modern artifacts of industrial culture, like plastics and things like that, we went through another one of these experiences. That would have been the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And here we are again with this world of computing and the internet and new forms of communication, mass communication, and we're having a hard time with it. I don't think it's really controversial at all to say that we're struggling with this quite a bit. Fascinatingly, I think younger people struggle with it less than older, and we look at the phenomenon on the internet of, for example, clickbait or spam. It largely targets people who are less familiar with internet scams and the way that information can be manipulated, right? When we look at, for example, fake news sites and bad information coming from social media sources, etc., the majority of those who believe those things are older. And I think there's a pretty simple explanation for these demographic differences, which is that younger people have simply grown up more with technology. It's less anomic, it's less strange, it's more their world, whereas those who have not grown up with that are more faced with this breakdown of normative structural culture, right? So you can see some of this in terms of generational shifts, but that's too much of a simplification, because what Durkheim was really getting at is that our nomos, our cultural norms, are ethological. They depend on the environment of our interested perspective, and those are going to shift. And when they do, in terms of mass culture, we're always going to run into these problems. Well, one of the ways that this emerged, as I said, for Durkheim was in the city itself, the city as this new modern space. His city was Paris, and Paris actually had undergone probably the greatest transformation of any modern city in the 19th century. The wonderful theorist Walter Benjamin called Paris the capital of the 19th century, which is fantastic. You can't have a capital of a century or a time, of course, but what he meant is that it was representative of the entire experience of modernity during that period. And that's partly because of this figure here, George Eugene Haussmann. Haussmann, in the 1850s and 60s, redesigned Paris. Paris used to be a medieval city. It looks something like this image here, where you had lots of churches and winding small alleys that had simply built up organically over hundreds and hundreds of years. You had animals going through all the time. You had the living right by the cemeteries of the dead. You had dirt roads everywhere, so it was filthy. It was, in other words, a typical medieval city. And what Haussmann did was to change all of those things by changing the values and the concepts by which we create cities. He did this with what we call urban planning. One of the first and most important things that he did was to take many of these winding streets and to mercilessly rip them out. He destroyed homes and made people move without thought to their personal needs or experience, because he wanted to do something that he saw as a larger and more valuable experiment, which is to create what we now think of as the famous Paris boulevards, these wide open spaces that you could walk down very easily, that are beautiful and uniform looking. He changed a lot more than just the city streets. He paved all of these streets. He passed building codes that mandated the houses had to be built with certain materials, a kind of limestone that gives many of the buildings this beautiful lustrous color, and you could build it no more than 4 stories high. Because of these design decisions that he made as an arbitrary dictator in this context, as the urban designer for Paris, right? He didn't ask anybody's opinions, he just did these things. But because of that, Paris is largely famous today for its extraordinary beauty. That's because we really celebrate many of the things he brought to the rational city. We believe that what he did generally was right. And I know that because we've all emulated him. All of the modern cities that were built after Paris, which is all of the large cities in the United States, were either built or reconstructed specifically along the model of Haussmann's values. And so what he did was to create a system of roads for transportation. He also created a system that made it much easier to survey people, right, to control people by making sure that everybody was out and visible in a space that was easy to monitor. For example, in the 19th century, Paris had been racked by a series of revolutions, and one of the things that the revolutionaries would often do is to barricade themselves in these narrow, winding roads and make it very hard for soldiers in the opposing army to come in and take them out. With these wide roads, you can see it'd be very hard to build a barricade, and also you could march whole armies up and down these streets, right? So there's an element of control as well as simply transportation going on here, and it's important to recognize that there is a history of correspondence and relation between those two things. Right? Also, and equally important to transportation and surveillance is the idea of shopping, right? That cities are spaces where you're supposed to go and spend money, and that commerce itself is one of the values that we associate with the city now. Even still today, but much more so in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, Paris was a place to go for shopping. And what Haussmann did was really emphasize that. In fact, shortly after he completed his work, the first shopping mall opened, and it opened in Paris. So we think of the mall, again, as a part of American life now, but really it was invented by this rational city. Another thing, again, not trivial at all, was that he introduced sewage, clean water, and those kinds of things. In fact, he revamped the entire sewage system in Paris so that many, many more people could come and live there safely without dying of disease. it may surprise you to know that the number one killer in the entire history of all humans for all time are bacterial diseases from human waste. Humans have killed each other the most, but the way that they've killed each other the most is by being polluted by each other in the drinking water or some other way that caused the many diseases that we associate with human waste. So again, not something we normally think about, but imagine your own city, right? Imagine Jacksonville or another city that you've lived in without proper sanitation. Within weeks, it would break down. Right, and it would become actually a fairly dangerous place to be with all of the people living here. So Haussmann really showed that was important, that hygiene and sewage went hand in hand. In Paris still today, every morning before most people wake up, so 4:30 or 5 in the morning, every single part of the streets in Paris are swept and washed down. They do that, by the way, with convict labor. They have prisoners who go through in this systematic way and clean the entire space. It's incredible, but it makes Paris look shiny and clean, and we actually really value those things about urban spaces. Although, interestingly, I'd say that the 20th century urban space has perhaps become less clean than Haussmann would have liked. All this leads to a kind of uniformity, doesn't it? And here we have that concept of the copy or the copious again. Look at the way that all of these houses are simply copies of each other, right? There's another really good illustration of the way we've moved in modern industrial urban mass culture to a world of the copious or the copy rather than the unique and individual. Well, there was a reaction to what Haussmann was trying to do. And it's important to recognize that there was a fear that the individual was going to be lost in this new mass culture. If we all live in these cities, we all act the same and live in these same spaces together, then perhaps we're going to lose something really valuable, this sense of individual, unique selfhood. The philosophical and political movement that embodied these concerns was called Romanticism in the 19th century, and it really was a brilliant and interesting movement. In France, specifically in Paris, it took the form of the writer Victor Hugo's argument with Eugene Haussmann about the destruction of one of the cathedrals in Paris, which is now so famous that we all know it, even if we haven't been to Paris, which is the Notre Dame. The Notre Dame was actually on an island in the middle of Paris, and Haussmann wanted to destroy it so that he could build a big road right through that area. And Victor Hugo, who thought that everything that Haussmann stood for, this modern mass culture, was terrible, and he wanted to have a kind of a throwback, a romantic fantasy of the value of medieval life that Paris really emblematized before Eugene Haussmann, that the way to do that was to save the Notre Dame. So he wrote an entire novel. Hugo wrote an entire novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, made into a Disney film. If you want to check out that plot, it loosely follows the novel. And he was so successful in his campaign of popularizing the medieval and this cathedral that he actually saved it almost single-handedly. And of course, he was part of a movement in that romantic reaction to modern industrial culture. But today, when people go to Paris, a lot of times they want to see the modern, beautiful Haussmannian boulevards, and they also want to see the beautiful medieval cathedrals, right? So again, oftentimes this happens. We live betwixt and between these different values, and we celebrate them in ways that maybe are incoherent, but nonetheless stand side by side, right? And that incoherence is only important if we think of Platonic identity as a singular experience, but look at the complexity that we actually figure out that we're living with as soon as we start to look at these spaces that we're in. So Haussmann did win out, though, right? So despite the romanticism and the reaction and the saving of the Notre Dame and all of those ideals that we had in the 19th century, especially in the 20th century, the modern city does become a space of bureaucratic rationalization. And here we have to take leave of Emil Durkheim and talk about the theorist, the sociologist in Germany who thought most seriously about rationalization and the consequences of this modern rational city, and that was Max Weber. Max Weber was really worried about what he called the iron cage of bureaucratic rationalization. If you've ever gone to the DMV and spent the whole morning waiting in line for what seemed like a pointless signature or stamp on a piece of paper or just to get something done, then you've understood exactly what Weber was worried about. You feel like a cog in a machine, and it's very depersonalized, right? So he wasn't a romantic in the sense that he wanted to save medieval cathedrals, but Weber was actually very concerned in his own way about the loss of individuality. And he talked about it in ways that really speak to our concerns still today. Again, if we take the model of Paris and think about what happened in that city in the 20th century, we see that what worked at first for Haussmann actually was taken too far with the 20th century thinkers and planners, most famously the urban architect named Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier was easily the most famous architect in France for his generation in the early 20th century, and he wanted to destroy large parts of Paris and replace them with these big impersonal buildings. And these at the time were brand new ideas, right? You could see the moquette, the mock-up here of the towers as they were supposed to be. So this would have been right in the middle of Paris, and it would have destroyed, again, large parts of the city, at this point Haussmann's old Paris, and replaced it with these big, ugly high-rises. Well, today we call these spaces projects, right? They're social housing, and the reason that those spaces don't work, that they're so ugly, is that nobody cares about them. Nobody cares for them, right? This is known as the tragedy of the commons, the idea that common spaces tend to be dismissed because we don't necessarily choose to live there. All right? So these ideal drawings that Le Corbusier came up with express a really essential problem with rationalization, which is that rationalization may be functional, but it's not always human. And this is what Max Weber was really interested in. We might rationalize our entire city and even our lives, but what do we get out of it, right? If we end up living in these big impersonal towers, just imagine yourself living in one of these spaces here, right? If you do that or engage in that process, then what do you lose in contrast? And that was something that Weber was very interested in. He thought that Le Corbusier's Plan Voisin was exactly that kind of expression of that loss of individuality. Ironically, Plan Voisin means the neighbor plan or neighborhood plan. Voisin means neighbor. And that's precisely what would have been lost, right? It was when you live in those kinds of apartment spaces, you don't talk to anybody, you don't know anybody in those kinds of worlds, right? Instead, you go to work, you come back, you stay in this small apartment, and your life goes on in this very humdrum and controlled way. Max Weber thought that would be the worst outcome possible, and he wasn't alone. He called this process disenchantment, right? Where we lose some feeling of the magic of the world. And along with Max Weber, there were a group of artists named the Surrealists, and the Surrealist movement really aimed at the re-enchantment of the world. They aimed at the resistance to this rationalization and structuring of the society. Watch this video here on Surrealism, and when I meet you back for chapter 11, we'll pick up with Surrealism and talk about how it resisted this bureaucratic rationalization in modern mass culture.